Fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the word in Arabic that's used is taqwa or khawf. Now, the concept of fear, and we mentioned this when we said, when we talked about hope, and we said that there needs to be a balance between fear and hope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order for there to be healthy iman. And the example that was given was the example that Ibn al-Qayyim rahimahullah describes about the bird. And the bird that has two wings and a head, and the head was the love of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that's what drives us, that's what leads us. And then the two sides, the two wings of the bird are fear and hope. And when you think about this example, he says that a bird that has one wing that's deficient or broken, it's going to be more susceptible to being shot down. So if your fear is deficient or your hope is deficient, you're going to be more susceptible to being shot down in your path to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or in your iman. So we have to have a balance. So today we're going to be focusing on khawf, on the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Fear is the spur with which Allah urges His servant towards knowledge and action so that they can draw nearer to Him. It is the pain and anguish of the heart when it senses that harm is imminent. Fear is what restrains the body from being disobedient and compels it to worship and service. When fear is lacking, this leads to negligence and boldness in committing sins, whereas too much fear results in a state of hopelessness and despair. So the emphasis that what we have to emphasize is that when you don't have enough fear, this is what can lead to disobedience and, overstepping the boundaries of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And at the same time, we see a situation sometimes where people have too much fear or not enough hope, and that actually is very paralyzing. A person who doesn't see any hope in redemption or doesn't see hope in the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and so then they also become paralyzed by that. So that's too much fear, not enough hope. Fear of Allah Azza wa Jal sometimes springs from knowledge of Him and of His attributes. The knowledge that it would be of little concern to Him to obliterate the heavens and the earth, and that nothing can stop Him from doing so if He so wishes. At other times, it is caused by the enormity of the wrong actions which the servant commits. At other times, it is caused by a combination of these things. So here, what is being said is that we can instill fear in our hearts of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from different sources, in different ways. One of the sources of fear is by understanding Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's attributes. And for example, knowing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is able to do anything. And if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, and because of His might, His power, if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wanted, the whole universe could be obliterated. Right? This is not something Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there's nothing difficult for Allah. And yet, what is it that balances, what is the most highly emphasized attribute of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? It's His mercy. So although Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has this power, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, He says in one hadith Qudsi, my mercy supersedes my wrath or my anger. So Allah has decreed Himself. He has decreed that. Nobody decreed that on Him. Nobody can decree anything on Him. He decreed that His mercy supersedes His anger or His wrath. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is here choosing to make mercy His strong, His most superseding quality or attribute. So although we know that, but by knowing still the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, it should instill fear in us. And by understanding His attributes and knowing about His wrath and about His punishment, that should instill khawf, fear in our hearts. At other times, it is caused by the enormity of our wrong actions. So one way to instill fear is to contemplate Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His attributes. Another way to instill fear is to contemplate our own sins, our own wrong actions, our own, deficiencies in fulfilling the rights of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When we contemplate, when we look at the discrepancy between what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is and what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserves, compare and contrast that to how much we give, that should instill fear in us because of how much we are lacking. But then what balances that? Again, because now you have, when you think about that, about the difference between what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala deserves compared to what I give, that should, right there, that should instill fear. So that's one side of the wing. But then what balances that is what? Hope. Hope in what? His mercy. Because if it were not for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's mercy, like, if Allah were to hold us accountable, like actually hold us accountable for everything we did and everything we didn't do, we would have no hope, to succeed. But because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is Al-Halim, the forbearing, Al-Ghafur, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim, all of these attributes of mercy and overlooking and pardoning, that's why we have some chance of being okay. And even the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ told his companions that nobody enters paradise by their deeds. And when they asked, and even his companions asked, even you, because we know the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ is the best of creation, so they said, even you, O Rasulullah, and he said, yes, even me. So that gives us an idea that it's not, that no matter what we do, we can never give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala his due measure, can never give Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala what he deserves, and our worship will always be deficient compared to what he is and what he deserves. Even the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, even the angels who don't do anything but worship Allah. We know from another hadith that there are angels that from the beginning of time till the end of time do nothing but sujood, do nothing but ruku'ah. That's all they don't sin, they don't do anything. And these angels, they are just created to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And yet even they say we have not worshipped you enough. This is to show us that the only way that we can be saved or enter Jannah or be okay is only by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we have the fear and it's balanced by the hope. And at other times it is caused by a combination of these two. This is the attributes of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, contemplating those as well as contemplating our own wrong action and our own sins and deficiencies. The degree of a servant's fear depends on his awareness of his own faults and on his awareness of Allah's glory, Azza wa Jal. And the awareness of Allah's might and self-sufficiency. So you can see that the more the person is aware, and the higher the level of awareness of Allah's power, Allah's might, Allah's self-sufficiency, the more that will instill fear. So the one who has more khashya, for example, is the one who has more knowledge. Khashya is related to knowledge, is directly related to knowledge. Knowledge, for example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran, he connects these two, and he says that the ones who have this fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those who have knowledge, or those who know. So the more knowledge you have, the more you will have that fear. And that kind of gives you also an idea about what is true knowledge. Yeah, because you might have information, but if that information is not eliciting fear of Allah, khashya, humility, like taqwa, then it's not true knowledge. It doesn't qualify as being the true knowledge, because it's not actually eliciting that response of the heart. It's just up here in the mind. And of the fact that he is not accountable for what he does and while his servants are. So that the knowledge that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is his might, his power, his self-sufficiency. The fact that Allah doesn't answer to us. I mean, we answer to Allah. Allah does not answer to us. We don't ask, this. We don't say, God, how could you, right? This is a word of kufr. You can't question God. And why is it that he does this? Allah is first, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can do whatever he wills, whatever he wants. It's easy. And also Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most just. Whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala decrees is pure justice. So we don't nobody can question God. The person who fears his Lord most is the one who has most knowledge of him and of himself. So again, this comes back to knowledge of Allah, what he is, and knowledge of me and what I am. And this is the other part of it. A person who is not aware of their own faults is not going to have proper fear. A person who's not aware of his own shortcomings isn't going to have the proper fear, because you might think that you're, okay, and you might actually be, someone who isn't aware of his own faults is going to be self-satisfied or self-pleased with themselves, and this is sort of gets into the realm of arrogance. And there's actually, in English we just have one word, which is arrogance, but in Arabic there's like different words that have different connotations related to arrogance. It's all clumped together in English. But in Arabic, subhanallah, there's ujub, and there's ghurur, and there's kibr. And they all mean different things, but they all have to do with arrogance. So, for example, the first level is, well, ujub. Let's talk about that. This is like maybe the most least like we'll start with that, because sometimes someone might say, well, I'm pleased about something, but it's true. It really is something in me. For example, somebody is pleased that they have a lot of money. They objectively maybe do have a lot of money. But ujub is when you are you're basically pleased with yourself. And it actually doesn't have anything to do with putting others down. It's just, and it doesn't have anything to do with putting others down, and it isn't misplaced, meaning it's based on something that you really do have. Okay, so you're pleased that you are very rich, or you're pleased that you're very maybe you have a lot of information, right? Not knowledge. It's not the true knowledge, because you wouldn't be arrogant, but that, or you wouldn't be pleased with yourself. That's ujub, right? So even that, and that's why this is kind of scary, because even if it's not putting others down, and even if it's accurate, like based on something you really have or own, or you think you own, and it's just given to you as a loan, then that's still something that is considered a disease of the heart. The next level you have, or the next type, is ghurur. And ghurur actually means to be deceived. So it's self-deception, but it's also used, it's an arrogance that's based on a wrong idea of your own estimation. Like your estimation is inaccurate. So you might think, I'm the smartest person in the world, and this is not true. Yeah, so because you think this, you're arrogant, but it's based on a wrong estimation. So that's ghurur, and that's because it has the same, exactly. It's still not putting anyone else down. That's not in this category. And so ghurur, and so that's self-deception. Yeah, you're kind of you're delusional. You think that they're in their own little world. Yeah, exactly. So you're basically you're arrogant about something that you don't even really have. Yeah, something that isn't even actually accurate. That's ghurur. And then you have kibr. Kibr is when you are, not only are you yourself pleased with yourself, but you put others down. You believe that you are superior to others. And that's why it comes from the same root as, when we say like Allahu Akbar, Allah is the greatest. So kibr is thinking that you're great, that you're high, that you're greater than other people. So different, 3 different categories. So subhanAllah, it isn't just, a lot of times people think that, as long as I'm not thinking I'm better than other people, but I'm just pleased with myself, but that's still a form of arrogance. That's ujub, and that's still a disease. So the person who is not aware, again, of the knowledge of the self, the true understanding of yourself, that's going to lead to arrogance. And if you do, the more you know yourself, the more you have knowledge, true knowledge of the self and of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the more khashya you're going to have, the more fear you're going to have. This is why the Prophet ﷺ said, by Allah, of all people, I am the one with the most knowledge of Allah, and I fear him the most. So because, again, this tells you that this needs to be the equation, that true knowledge should, by definition, lead to more fear of Allah. And if it doesn't, then that means it's not true knowledge. Okay, Imam Ash-Sha'bi was once addressed as, O knowledgeable one. He replied, I am not, for the knowledgeable one is the one who fears Allah, as He, Azza wa Jal, has said, what is translated as, surely those of His servants who know fear Allah. And that's chapter 35, verse 28. So you see how this scholar, again, he's pointing out even though he had knowledge, right? He was a scholar, but he's pointing out here that the true knowledge has to do directly with fear. It also kind of makes you think about those scholars, even though they had the information, they feared others more than they feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we know from history that there were some scholars, for example, were, like the kings would tell them, they would basically be bought off. Yeah, like puppets, exactly. So they would be threatened, or they would basically be working for the state, kind of, and they would not, they kind of sell out, right? So the idea here is that there was something that they feared more than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is, even though they had the knowledge, so this isn't that meant that knowledge wasn't really internalized It was the knowledge of the mind and not the knowledge of the heart or the real internalized experiential knowledge. The one who experiences fear is not the one who weeps and wipes his eyes, but the one who abandons whatever may bring punishment upon him. This is an important point. Yeah, so you could cry out of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And this is something that, if it's something from the state of the heart, this is something that's really amazing, right? But if you're not actually keeping yourself from that which you're crying about, it's not really fear, because you might cry about it, but then you go ahead and do those things which lead to the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So you can't really say that you're fearing the punishment if you're not protecting yourself from it. Dhunnun al-Misri was once asked, when is a servant really afraid? And he replied, when he is in the same state as a sick man who seeks protection in Allah out of fear that his sickness will be prolonged. When he is in the same state as a sick man who seeks protection in Allah out of fear that his sickness will be prolonged. So, fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala should be something that, regardless of our external circumstance, it remains the same. Like, this is what's being said here. So a person who's sick or who feels like death is near, they're going to be at a certain level of fear. Someone comes and tells you you're diagnosed with cancer, and you're told that you have 6 months to live. Now all of a sudden your level of fear is going to go up, because now you feel like you're closer to death, or you don't know what's going to happen. But the idea is that the true fear should be something, regardless of the external circumstance, you have that state of fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Abdul Qasim al-Hakim said, whoever fears something runs away from it, while whoever fears Allah runs towards him. It's subhanAllah. It's so interesting how Allah, if you think about the creation, when you're afraid, how does a human being act when he's afraid of another human being? He avoids them, he runs away from them, he escapes from them, he tries to hide from him, right? And this is why, actually, we sometimes make this mistake with Allah, because this is how we are with humans. When you're afraid of a human being, you avoid them. But subhanAllah, with Allah, it's the exact opposite. The more you fear Allah, the more you actually run to Allah. That's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That out of fear, like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, firru ilallah. فَفِرُّوا إِلَى اللَّهِ, meaning escape to Allah, in Allah, right? What are you escaping? When you're escaping to Allah, who are you escaping from? Allah. So that's only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that you run from Him to Him. You run from, exactly. You're escaping His wrath. You're running from His wrath, but there's only one protection from His wrath, and that's Him. So you run from His wrath to Him. So subhanAllah, that there's no other situation like that. The creation is the opposite. The more you fear the creation, the more you run away from it. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the opposite, subhanAllah. And Allah is the only, He's the only protection. He's the only protection from Himself. Even Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, Allah says, وَيُحَذِّرُكُمُ اللَّهُ نَفْسَهُ. Like, so amazing. Allah says, and Allah, this ayah, what it means is, and Allah warns you against Himself. Allah is warning you against Himself. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the refuge from His wrath, subhanAllah. And there's no other refuge. It's the same way where Allah, we all know Allah is the end, right? Allah is our goal, ultimate. But how do you get to Allah? Can you get to Allah without Allah? No. So Allah is the end, and Allah is also the means to get to Allah, because basically, if I say I want to get to Allah, I want to be a good Muslim, right? But can I do that without guidance? Can I do that without His help? No. إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ وَإِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ. You alone do we worship, and you alone do we seek help from. We cannot worship Allah without the help of Allah. SubhanAllah. So we cannot get to Allah without Allah, and we cannot escape or seek refuge from the wrath of Allah except in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Al-Fudayl ibn Iyad said, if you are asked whether you fear Allah, do not reply. For if you say yes, you would be lying, and if you say no, it would mean that you do not believe in Him. So it's basically that the fact that we seek to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but we can never fear Him or give Him Assalamu alaikum. We can never fear him or give him what he really deserves. So if you're asked in this statement, if you're asked, do you fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Well, if you say yes, yeah, you don't really fear him as much as he deserves to be feared. And yet if you say no, that means you don't believe in him. Because to know him is to fear him. But we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to increase our fear of him, although we can never really fear him or measure him as he actually is. This is because we're limited. Fear burns up forbidden desires, and the wrong actions which can be so dear to a servant soon become distasteful, just as honey becomes repugnant to someone who desires it if he discovers that it's poisoned. That's a really powerful example. Imagine a person who's craving honey and like runs to it, and maybe even just like ingests all this honey, and then right after taking all this honey finds out that what they just ate was all poisoned. That person's going to want to vomit. All of a sudden, the thing that seemed sweet and seemed beautiful and seemed wonderful seems disgusting. Looks and feels and tastes repugnant. And this is the same thing with. So this, why does this happen? So what causes in this case? What causes that object to go from something desirable to something disgusting? It's just the knowledge, because nothing yet. Say you just finding that out. Nothing has yet happened to you, but just the knowledge, even if it really wasn't poisoned, but someone told you that it was, and you thought that it was. So just that knowledge alone turns this thing that you used to love into something that you hate. So, and that is out of fear. That's because we know that poison kills us. So it's that fear that does that. So if you think about a situation where, something that looks very attractive, or, something that's haram, but it looks attractive. If you feel like that thing is going to poison you, or that thing is going to kill you, all of a sudden it's not going to look attractive anymore to you. The problem is, it's the way we see things, the way we understand things, and that's why what is displeasing to Allah can look pleasing to us. It's just because of the way our lack of knowledge, our lack of insight, our lack of sight. We don't actually see things as they really are. Nobody would ever say, yeah, I know this is going to kill me, but I just can't keep myself from eating this poison, unless you actually really want to die. You're not going to do that. It's not going to be something you're going to want. So this is the point. We don't really see what Allah has forbidden as what it is, which is poison. We don't really see it for what it is. We see it instead as something else. We haven't really fully gotten that knowledge. It hasn't gone in here. Even if someone tells you and you have it in your mind up here, it hasn't gone in here if you're still desiring it. No one's going to desire something that's going to cause them to die a painful, torturous death. And this is just a worldly example, but the punishment of the hereafter is not like a worldly punishment. It's infinitely worse. Fear tames the limbs and fills the heart with submission, humility, and tranquility. Arrogance, hatred, and envy depart from it, and it is filled with him through fear of him and through contemplating the danger of his punishment, and so it becomes occupied with nothing other than him, and has no concern other than contemplation, bringing itself to account and striving in the way of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you have somebody threatening you, a person, say it's a human being, threatening you, and basically has like a gun to your head and telling you, if you don't do this, this, and this, then this is going to happen. That fear of that gun is going to basically, you're not going to be thinking about anything else. The reason I'm bringing this example is not to compare Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to somebody who has a gun to your head, but of course not. But the idea here is how we are motivated by fear to focus, and how we're motivated to act by fear, how we're motivated not to act by fear. Fear is a powerful motivator. So if I'm being threatened by someone, all I'm going to be thinking about is how to avoid that threat, how to avoid that harm. I'm not going to be thinking about worldly things if my life is in danger, right? The more that we understand the punishment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the severity of it, the more we will just focus on protecting ourselves from that, protecting ourselves from the wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and his anger. And actually the word taqwa itself is to cover, it means to cover yourself or to protect yourself from the punishment or wrath of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The example that we were given is like someone who's walking in a forest and there's thorns, and the same way that you try to avoid, you try to keep your clothes from getting caught in the thorn. You know how you will have to walk? How do you do that? If there's thorns everywhere and you're walking through, how are you going to keep yourself from getting caught in the thorns? You have to be really careful, right? You go this way and this way. You're not going to just like haphazardly walk through. That's like taqwa, where we are careful in the way we walk, careful in the way we act, careful in what we do, lest we, bring on the anger of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So it's a protection. It's being, mindful and careful to protect ourselves from that punishment and from that wrath and that anger. A servant with such a heart becomes watchful over every breath and every moment, and constantly reprimands the self for its inner thoughts, its actions, and its words. One thing that really makes a person focus very quickly is death, right? When you think about if you get faced with death, all of a sudden, the things that seemed very important become irrelevant. And the things which seemed irrelevant become very important, oftentimes. And this is death that does this. The fear of death, because it's just something about death, because now it's like you see, when death approaches, or even just the thought of death. And this is why the Prophet ﷺ, he told us to remember death often, because when you really think about death, it puts things into perspective. What really matters? Wait a minute, why am I even worrying about this or this thing? How much is it going to matter? That's how we start to think. That's why the more we think about death and realize that this life will come to an end, the more we can sort of have things in the proper perspective. Whereas when you think that you're going to live forever, which is unfortunately, sometimes, and this is the deception of being young. This is one of the deceptions of being young. As you age, you start to think about death more. But the young person has this idea that, oh, death, like as if it's never going to happen. And so that's why also they live a little bit more carelessly. Even just the way they drive. Compare a teenager who's 16 years old, especially a teenage guy, and the way he drives or she drives, to like a 75-year-old. You see my point? Like, you know when you have like an old person driving in front of you, because they're driving very slow and really nervous and really careful and really, really close to the steering wheel, and there's this fear that death is around the corner. But when you're young, you feel like, oh, I'm never gonna die. You do all these reckless things. The idea here is that you act in this way because you don't really see that's something that your life it will come to an end, and it could come at any time. So it's very important that we constantly remind ourselves of this. This will automatically put things more into their proper perspective. Death just has that effect. His state is like that of a person who is trapped in the claws of a lion, not knowing whether it will leave him alone or allow him to escape, or whether it will attack him and kill him. Thus he becomes both inwardly and outwardly occupied with what he fears. There is no room in him for anything other than what he fears. This is the state of a person who is overwhelmed by fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That is a deep example. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has power over everything, and so the example here is really powerful, where imagine someone who's already in the between the teeth of a lion, but the lion hasn't done anything yet, and that person doesn't know whether that lion will devour the person or leave them. We are all like, the entire universe is in the dominion of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? تبارك الذي بيده الملك. That the mulk, the dominion of the heavens and the earth, is in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's hand. I mean, it's already, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala already has that grip, and is there any promise, is there any guarantee that he doesn't destroy the universe? I mean, is there any guarantee? We have to realize, like, for example, the nations that came before us, we're told in the Quran about their stories for a reason, that when the decision of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala came, they were destroyed immediately, right? The decision came day, decision came night. And this is like something that we're supposed to take as a lesson at the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in Surah Al-Mulk, actually it's interesting because the beginning, the ayah that I just quoted, was in the beginning of Surah Al-Mulk, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala begins by saying, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تبارك الذي بيده الملك وهو على كل شيء قدير. So here Allah is talking about the how the dominion of the heavens and the earth is in his hand, and he's able to do anything. And then later on in the surah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, there are many different sort of threats or rhetorical questions that are given to mankind, and one of them is about the fact that, like, actually just basically this theme is repeated many times, and that is that if an earthquake comes or a tornado or any of these natural disasters come, who's going to save you? If what army or you know what protection do you have other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? If Allah were to send something on you, who's going to save you from it? So it's this, and then at the end of the surah, it ends with, if one day you wake up and you find that your water source is disappeared, who's going to bring you water? It's just these questions. These are things that we take for granted. Like, we take for granted that right now the earth is still. We live in California. That's not right. That's not something we should even take for granted. Just because the earth right now, we're sitting on it and it's not shaking. But if it shakes, who's going to save you? We have water, but if it all disappeared, who's going to bring you water? And if Allah holds his rizq, this really, subhanAllah, in this surah, is it begins by talking about the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and this theme is repeated again and again and again of who is there other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who can protect you? Who is it other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala who can provide for you? As one of the questions that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala poses is that if Allah were to hold your provision, who would give you? Who would provide for you? In amsaka rizqa. When I first was like memorizing the surah, it was when I was studying biology, and we started studying the way that, have you guys ever studied the way that HIV works in the body? It's absolutely fascinating, because you know how usually a disease comes, and it's the disease itself, the disease itself comes and it like attacks you, but the way that subhanallah, the way that the HIV virus works is it goes to, so what we did is we studied the immune system, and there's this basically the center of the immune system is these killer T cells, yeah. And what does HIV do? It comes and attacks that, and it is the center of the immune system. So you have this diagram, and when that's taken out, the entire immune system just crashes. So look at what's happening here. Our immune system is a rizq from Allah. Our immune system is a provision from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. All he has to do is withhold it, and what happens? That's what HIV is. That's all it is. It's not even like a new disease, like it's just a withholding of something you already had. Something that we take for granted. We sneeze. Why do we say alhamdulillah when we sneeze? We say alhamdulillah when we sneeze because if we weren't able to sneeze, we would be in big trouble. Because the fact that we can sneeze means our immune system is working. And if we couldn't sneeze, anything would kill us. And we have an example of that with the people who have HIV or AIDS, because that same sneezing that we take for granted is what's keeping us alive. SubhanAllah. All Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala do, if he were to just withhold that one cell, just that one killer T cell, look at what happens. It is humbling. So the point here is that Allah is saying that who is going to provide for you in amsaka rizq, if I were to just hold your provision. And this is, subhanAllah, I don't know, it just made me think of that what happens to a person when Allah holds the provision of just one part of the immune system. What happens?